Welcome back. And I guess this report just briefed us on many decisions that were taken by the government. This strategic plan that was put by the government of utmost importance at this particular stage, where the Egyptian economy is, of course, in need for a precise plan and path for this upcoming stage in light of the global economic crisis. Let me again welcome our guest, Dr. Mohamed Fahmy, Professor of Middle East Politics at the AUC. Again, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, my pleasure.
And we've just seen together this brief report. Yesterday, the Prime Minister spoke in detail about the government's strategic plan for this upcoming stage. You're reading to this important announcement by the government yesterday, and how do you view the pillars that were taken inside those pillars?
Yes, I think it's a very important event that took place yesterday. I mean, first of all, we will discuss shortly the content of the Prime Minister's message and communicate it with the rest of the world, I think, because this was also an international conference. But importantly, also I think it reflects a deep and profound understanding of the current status of the Egyptian economy and awareness of the major challenges and opportunities that the country is facing at the moment. And it also outlines a number of steps, clear-cut procedures that the government will be undertaking in the coming period in order to offset or meet these challenges. So I think the overall process, the overall image of the event was very positive, and also its content was very important. Because, I mean, actually a lot of the data that was revealed were for the public, I think, revealed or transparent for the first time. I mean, a lot of these things were not really obvious to the public and also to the international community. So I think it's very important also as part of the transparency that the Egyptian government and state is taking part in, to actually reveal that to the rest of the world, to say that we have nothing to hide and this is the data of the economy and we are working on addressing the challenges that we are facing.
Indeed, indeed. That is that was a very frank and transparent discussion between the Prime Minister. As you noticed yesterday, the Prime Minister took every question that was asked from the local and international press. Indeed. And answered precisely, and of course left the ministers to answer the rest. That was very clear message. If we speak about the pillars the Prime Minister spoke about, because there are so many. We're speaking here about presidential initiatives, we're speaking here about investment, we're speaking here about industry, we're speaking here about the stock market, we're speaking here about an all-out integral plan put for the economy at this upcoming stage. Let me first take your reading to how the Prime Minister addressed the issue of investment, particularly.
Well, the issue of investment, I think it's very important on the agenda of any developing country, including Egypt, of course. Before we start discussing these pillars, I think it's also important to start with the situational analysis that the Prime Minister has provided and clarified the main areas that were hit hardest as a result of both the pandemic and then the Russian-Ukrainian conflict.
Yes.
And these three sectors are very impactful, influential on the Egyptian economy. The first of which is the tourism sector, which was hit very hardly by both. The second is the food sector, also very important as a result of the conflict. We know Egypt is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, importers of wheat in the world.
Yes.
So this definitely required a major shift in Egypt strategic relations.
Yes, just remind me to come back to this wheat issue, because we will we also had heard what Dr. Ali Musalhi said in this concern, but please continue.
Yes. And the third is the energy sector. Again, because of the shortage in energy cycles and imports also from Russia and Ukraine, and the impact this had on the global cycle of energy production and exportation. So these three sectors are pivotal to the Egyptian economy, and they influence Egypt's position in the global economy in different ways and shapes. So as a result of these shocks that the economy has received, it was important for the government or the state to respond in equal measures. I think the pillars that you have just mentioned and that were highlighted yesterday by the Prime Minister all address these challenges in different ways. The first pillar that you mentioned, investment, is of course extremely important. But I think one categorical question that we need to focus on here is what is the kind of investment that we really need to attract to the economy in order for it to thrive. At the same time, the Prime Minister has also highlighted that over the past few months, Egypt has lost around $20 billion of capital flight investment coming out of the country, leaving the country, because of these continuous fluctuations. The problem here is, you know, we for a very long time we have looked at investment as a macro indicator, as a lump sum figure, and we settle down for a certain figure of investment in any sector. And that's not really sufficient. It's important for us as a country to also have a set of priorities for what kind of sectors we want to focus on in terms of investment. And I think this was alluded to also yesterday by the Prime Minister. For instance, in terms of the kind of capital flight that we saw leave Egypt over the past few months, it was mostly from the stock market, again, small enterprises or small investors that aim at quick gains and that for the most part move their capital, whether small or medium, around the stock exchanges in the world. Now, for a country like Egypt, the priority should be not in that direction. It should be in the direction of long-standing industries, technology transfers, job creation. These are the sectors that will really help the economy and improve the status of these deficiencies and challenges that we have in our economy. Now, this can happen, again, if coupled with the other sectors or pillars that were also mentioned in yesterday's conference.
Yes, but I would like to stress more on this point because, yes, indeed, it's a very important point. Definitely, the $20 billion that we lost were not an indicator due to what you have just respectively said. So what I got from what you said, that we need to focus on certain investments that are long-term, running long-term.
Exactly.
We're speaking here about some sectors that we need to focus on. Tell me, what do you think about that?
Well, I think, again, Egypt is a developing country in a world that is full of developed countries. You know, we're not really alone in the world. So there have been success stories, lessons learned from the experiences of other developing countries. And one of the most widespread or common experiences in that regard is the fact that investment is only thriving and only beneficial when it's in developmental sectors, in the industrial sector, for instance, in sectors that work on job creation, employment opportunities, and sectors that build technology transfer and educational learning. You know, all of these features are some of the criteria that we need to focus on as a country in terms of attracting investment. I mean, investment in its own right is definitely a positive feature. No country would not want to have investments, but it's important also for a country like Egypt with its regional position and its powerful infrastructure and stable economic and political systems to be also selective or to have its own set of priorities or preferences when it comes to the kind of investment that it works on attracting.
When we're speaking about long-term or long-standing investments, we're speaking here about investments in important areas. Definitely, when we are speaking about any investments, any kind of foreign direct investments, that would need a kind of encouragement for those investors in order to be able to come and invest the money in long-standing investments and endure the circumstances or the global circumstances in search for the upcoming stage benefits. What kind of attractions do we need to put for investors in order to be able to attract them to come and invest here in Egypt?
Okay. Now, there are different layers to this. I mean, first of all, there are the already existing benefits of the country. The relatively available and cheap labor, the infrastructure that has improved massively over the past few years, and even from before. We have a stable, again, system. All of these are existing, long-standing, sustainable factors that would automatically attract a lot of investors throughout the world, especially at this moment in time, when we have a lot of regional turmoil. When at the same time, this is also coupled with a lot of promise and potential for this region, being a relatively youthful region, a growing middle class. So there's a lot of opportunity here for market expansion. And Egypt is one of the biggest countries, also in terms of population. So the opportunities are there, the sort of ready-made or the automatic feature that would attract investors. But on the second hand, also there comes another layer, which is what the government or the state is providing on top of that to attract more investment. And over the past, again, few years, there have been a lot of attempts to improve the environment. We saw the One-Stop Shop, for instance, initiative that was to a great extent successful in reducing the bureaucratic layers and the administrative hurdles that would usually hinder investors and delay the process and waste a lot of time and effort and money. We saw improvements in that regard. But I think still more needs to be done. The private sector, which is, again, one of the pillars that were discussed yesterday, it needs a lot of empowerment. It needs more room for competition, for positive relations also with the financial institutions in the country, the banks, you know, all of these financial entities also. There needs to be, I think, much more trusty or trustworthy relationship with the private sector. I think we've had enough of this sort of, you know, perception towards the private sector being a corrupt sector, being the businessmen who eat up all the wealth of the country. I think from experience, this has proven to be one of the most important factors that would lead to development. The private sector does need to be empowered and does need to receive this kind of support from the state on many levels.
And here the Prime Minister said that the government is intending to take more participation from the private sector, increasing its participation from 30 to 65.
Yeah.
So the Prime Minister here mentioned the state ownership policy, which is supposed to be announced by the end of this month. What should we be expecting from this document?
Well, I think it's a continuation of a policy that Egypt has been following for a very long time now, since we started the agreements with the World Bank and the IMF, since the RCEP in the early 1990s, in which the government or the state started privatizing a lot of its own assets. A lot of public sector companies were subject for private ownership, either sold directly to private investors or liquidated in the stock exchange. So it's a continuation of this policy. It's not clear yet. I mean, some of the companies were mentioned yesterday, others were not yet mentioned, so we're yet to see which sector, which companies are to be sold in the or its assets would be privatized in the stock or to the investors. But I think it's also here important, again, building on another pillar that was mentioned, which is the one regarding the social security and the safety networks, because this is, I mean, these sectors are also important for the development of the country. And one of the main challenges, or maybe even mistakes that were done before, is that this privatization has taken place without taking into consideration the social and the economic cost on the labor sector or on the people working in these fields. So it's here also important for this privatization to be successful, and for the buy-in to be also there from even the workers themselves within these companies and from within these sectors, is for this to be coupled by a very powerful and effective safety network.
Dr. Fahmy, yesterday when the Prime Minister spoke about the private sector, he also mentioned the presidential initiatives or the many initiatives that have been taking place. And he said that he wants their contribution. And indeed, I mean, there are lots, I mean, the presidential initiatives were focusing on one thing and suddenly it enlarged its umbrella. And hence, the private sector can really help a lot. Let me see or take your idea of how private sector can really contribute to existing already initiatives, programs and plans, and even projects made in these areas.
I think it's a two-way process. You know, when I mean, for instance, most private sector companies today, whether Egyptian or regional or international, they have foundations. What's called the foundation. The foundations are part of the private company or enterprise, but it's mainly dedicated to social work and to charity work and developmental work. These foundations, I believe, are way below their potential. There is so much more that they can do in terms of development. It's not only about partnering on small initiatives that aim at, you know, marketing campaigns or raising awareness regarding the brand. Well, there is much more that they can do, but this has to be also coupled with a bigger role for the private sector in the economy. And we cannot possibly expect these foundations to grow on their own. It has to be also coupled with much more investment and growth for the private companies themselves in the economic field. So this is one aspect, more participation from the foundation of major corporations, whether international or local, in initiatives such as Tahya Masr or in Decent Life. You know, all of these initiatives, we've seen some participation from the private sector over the past period, but I think a lot more can be done. But again, the private sector's input would be, well, we are currently also not maximizing our potential. We are also facing a lot of challenges. So we need to grow as well. We need to garner more profits in order for us to be able to participate more in such initiatives. So it's a two-way process. I think with more opportunities, more growth and empowerment for the private sector, we should also expect them to participate more in such initiatives.
Dr. Fahmy, one of the most or the biggest pillars of any country to grow is the industry sector. How do you view how the government see the industry, particularly that we are speaking about preserving our foreign reserves in light of the huge crisis that are, or rather crises, because they are a crisis, that are ongoing worldwide, and the fluctuation or the liberalization of the pound in front of the dollar and all this. So we're speaking here about imports and exports, and yet the gap is still so big. But most of what we import are products that can be produced here, or what do you think?
Well, I think we have to take a deep look into the portfolio of imports and exports in Egypt. And I think if we do that, we will find that Egypt actually imports all kinds of goods and services that range from the luxury goods to the small, maybe not necessary sort of small items and market inputs. So the bill of imports of Egypt is huge. But I think also the government needs to be categorical here. I think an important point that the Prime Minister mentioned yesterday was localization. And by that he means, I think, clearly he means more role for the local products in the economy. But we have to also understand that this localization or this increased industrial input from within the country is also dependent in different ways on imports. Most of our industrial sector is dependent on input material that comes through imports. So we cannot possibly equate or deal with both or different types of foreign currency requirements from the private sector equally. For instance, if there is an industry that employs hundreds of people and that helps the economy by producing local goods, yet that is dependent on certain kinds of imports and requires credit from banks, I cannot by any means deal with these entities on the same, by the same token, like import-export, for instance, companies that import luxury goods.
You mean here the raw material and the machines and all these stuff?
Exactly. If the the government has to be categorical, and I hope that this is that this will be one of the steps that will be taken in the coming period in dealing with requests for foreign reserves. If it's for industrial purposes, then it has to be dealt definitely with a favorable approach rather than the other items towards just mere imports that would be either in the luxury sector or in the different sectors that are not really related to industries.
So we're speaking here about differentiating between issues that we really need to import because of their necessity and issues that we do not really need because we can locally produce them and they can be available. What do we need at this upcoming stage and what do our economy need, not just from the government but also from citizens, before we move on to our next segment?
I think, again, it's a two-way process. I mean, the government can only work in tandem with the society. And I think it is happening already that people will have to have this realization that there is a huge import bill that can be substituted with local goods, whether in the food, for instance, sector, or even in the daily sort of affairs, books, paper, raw materials, a lot of things that we just take for granted that are being imported for cheap from economies or markets like from China or from Turkey, from other places. And there are substitutes. These substitutes actually may be more expensive. Yet, if you factor in the entire process of the foreign currency that goes into these imports, into the maybe even jobs lost or the competition that the local industries are facing from the cheaper goods coming from abroad, you'll find that the cost-benefit analysis of reducing these goods might be actually in the favor of the Egyptian economy.
Yes, indeed. Now we move on to our second segment, but before we start or proceed with the episode, let's take the second report. And Egypt, Tunisia announced 2022-2023, a year of activating economic cooperation. Let's watch.